Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Negative Space panel slash podcast, soon to be. Appreciate y'all being here. I missed you all last month when I didn't get a chance to join. I was busy running around wild at San Diego Comic-Con, but missed you all and glad that Josh was able to take over and do his thing. Only announcement that I have is keep an eye out on our newsletter. Tonight or tomorrow morning, we'll be sending out a newsletter officially announcing our winner of our Spaces competition. Very excited to get that out there and get this person started on their mentorship hours. They'll be working with three amazing mentors. Very excited for that moment. And we just closed out our regular deadline for our short comics competition, but final deadline will be September 10th. So you still have a good bit of time to submit to that one. I've already seen a lot of amazing short comics coming through. And just to remind you all our finalists get put together into an anthology that we share around with everyone that we know. So don't miss out. Check that out. All our info is obviously on our website. And I'll cut myself off there, bring Josh back in, and let's get to it because I'm excited to just sit in, chill, and listen in on this one, fun one.
Thanks, Noel.
All right, Josh, have fun.
Will do. Yeah, like you said, thank you all for being here. We have a good one today. Before we get started, quick reminder, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A on the Zoom dashboard and ask them as soon as you have them. I'll get to them as soon as I can. And yeah, so let's get into today. So we've got two panelists today. First up, Laura Gao is a queer artist, author, bread lover, and everything in between. Originally from Wuhan, China, Gao immigrated to Texas, where their art career began by doodling on Pokémon cards and has since blossomed to be featured at NPR, the Museum of Chinese in America, and most notably, their parents' fridge. Their works include the viral webcomic The Wuhan I Know and the best-selling graphic memoir that was inspired by it, Messy Roots. Hello, Laura.
Hey, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. Next up, Tiffany Yap is a conservation scientist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She holds a doctorate in environmental science and engineering and has published studies in science, EcoHealth, and other scientific journals. Her work has been featured in major news outlets, including the New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. Hello, Tiffany.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you both for being here. So we're gonna start where we always do, which is I want to hear your creative origin story. What made you want to tell stories in the first place? So Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think if we wanted to start all the way back to what really got me into comics, when I was very, very young, I think the very first comic I ever had was this like Xeroxed copy of this very old, like Russian silent comic about a dad and a son that my mom just like randomly found somewhere. I don't actually even know how she got a copy of it, but she like Xeroxed it hand by hand and like hand bound it. And then I remember reading that so much that it would like come undone every few weeks. And later on, once I like started to want to make my own, I would, since it was like a silent comic, I would put in my own speech bubbles and like have the characters kind of like tell the story I want them to tell. So that's like kind of how I got into comics in general as a medium. But in terms of my career, I actually came sort of like lucked in, sort of worked into this a few years back in 2020 when a comic of mine, the one in that bio, the one I know, went viral on social media. And up until then, I'd been working a completely different desk job and only did comics as a passion. But when it went viral, a bunch of publishers and editors like sort of called me up and like really wanted to make it a full-on graphic memoir. And yeah, and ever since I've been doing comics full time.
How much there I want to get back to. Well, let's hear from Tiffany. Tiffany, what made you come? You know, you've done a lot of academic writing and studies. What made you come to this side of writing?
Yeah, when I reflect on it, it's kind of it's been a wild ride, I guess, is how I would describe it. Like, I think as so I studied biology and ecology. And in the academic world, you know, when you're doing these studies and producing these papers, you don't know who's going to read it, and it's usually a very small audience that's interested and going to read it. And I was always kind of in the mind frame where, like, well, I really want the work that I do to really contribute to conservation and help push conservation forward of sensitive species and sensitive habitats that I really love. And we're in school and even after school, people are always telling us, well, you need to figure out your storytelling. Scientists need to do better at storytelling. And it was just kind of like, okay, but can someone help us? Because we don't know how to do that, you know? And it wasn't until I got a job at a nonprofit called the Center for Biological Diversity, where, again, the work I do is to protect habitats and species. And I was just reading all these horrible things that were happening on the planet that, like, people were the main cause of, right? And so it was like, how do we communicate this information to people outside the scientific world? Because it's not just scientific people that live in this world. We are so diverse. We have so many different people living in this world and, like, different ways of telling stories. So how do we communicate to people, like, you know, the struggle of mountain lions, or the struggle that wildlife face in an urban wildland interface where there are people and animals? And so it just kind of, from there, I would learn more and more about certain species struggles and try to find ways to do that. And before that, before this book came along, it was really through op-eds and, like, letters to the editor when things would come up, if, like, a mountain lion got hit by a car on a road, you know, and just, like, having reactions to that, and then kind of really noticing that people started to I don't know if empathize is the right word, but kind of connect with, like, I'm driving on this road, I'm like, our cars are hitting these animals, and so it was just trying to find ways to connect it where it's like, not just animals that are far away that we need to protect, but they're also in our own backyards, or they're very nearby. They're in places we go every day. And so I think it was really lucky and by chance that a publisher read one of my op-eds and then reached out to me and was like, hey, like, would you be interested in writing a graphic novel about this? And I was just like, what? I'm intrigued, but, like, how, you know? And so it's definitely been a process, but it's been really cool, and I feel really lucky.
I love that. I love that you both kind of were just doing your thing and then it got noticed. And that's, you know, one of the hard things I think for writers and artists of all types is to put your work out there, because you just never know. But I want to ask you both sort of about, you know, there's always this sort of a debate between, do you study writing formally or do you just sort of learn as you go? Curious how much you pursued, like, taking classes of writing and artistry, or if this was just all self-taught. So Tiffany, let's start with you.
Well, I would say that in terms of writing, I learned a lot of writing through school, and it was academic writing. Like, I went through my bachelor's, and then I got a master's degree in environmental health sciences, and then I got a doctorate in environmental science and engineering. And all along the way, we were kind of, like, taught and given steps on how to write a scientific paper. And so that's kind of, I think, where the formal training of that has really informed how I write now in the work that I do outside of this book. So I work full-time at the Center for Biological Diversity as a scientist. And so there's definitely a lot of writing there. And I think with the graphic novel, it was very challenging to kind of switch my brain in a way that can kind of make use of the imagery and visuals to tell a story and not just have to use words or prose on a page. And so, like, so with that, it was a lot of reading other graphic novels. So one of the first graphic novels I read was Laura's, and I was like blown away at how incredible it was and how like connected I felt to it. And so, that was kind of an inspiration to how can I write a story where people can connect to it as well. And so then from there, she also very kindly recommended other books for me to read. And so that was really helpful too. And so I guess it was kind of a mix of like formal training and also just kind of navigating and seeing what's out there and how I can create something.
Sure. Laura, what about you? What did you have any formal training, or was this all self-taught?
I've largely been self-taught. I think the only writing class I remember ever taking in college was a comics class, actually. And that was because everyone in my undergrad was forced to take a single writing credit. And I was like, I'm going to choose the one that's all pictures. And funny enough, that comic class was sort of like what got me into making comics and like studying it as a craft. But like as I said, I was working a different desk job, so my major was in something completely different. I'd studied like business and data, and just like really like boring sounding things. And once I started really getting into comics, especially after I got the book deal, I was like, okay, I really need to like sort of like do my own self catch up with what I thought was really great out there in the industry. So similar to Tiffany, I just kind of binged as many graphic novels as well as since I was writing for young adult, as many like young adult prose novels too, to kind of learn the craft of both writing and graphic novels and art. Thankfully, the art knowledge that was developed throughout my childhood and like teenage years. I took art classes all the way up to college, but the writing itself, I also listened to a lot of podcasts. And funny enough, this is a podcast as well. Like I gained so much knowledge through listening to writing podcasts and reading specific kind of like writing plotting books that helped me build up the building blocks to what I was missing in the book.
And then why, I kind of got a sense for this from both of you, but I'm curious why this story. Like Laura, with you, it sounds like you had written this webcomic, so maybe starting there with why that was the story that needed to be told, and then expanding from there why it needed to be told in a bigger form.
Yeah, so this webcomic stemmed out of a lot of the current events happening in 2020. As like everyone's pretty well aware, it was when COVID started, but also it was when some of the worst anti-Asian racism in like modern history also happened. And it affected me personally really, really deeply because my entire family is in Wuhan. And so they were there during the lockdown. I had experienced a lot of like indirect and like direct racism kind of being in San Francisco, and like just like hearing about like the way that politicians and folks online were like talking about my hometown as well. And so when I first decided to make the Wuhan I Know, the webcomic, it was never meant to be something to be seen by everyone in the world, right? Like at the time, it was purely just, here's all these conflicting emotions I have as like a Chinese American immigrant from Wuhan during this really confusing time. And I took like a week off from work as a mental health break and just used that time to like turn all my thoughts onto paper as a comic. And I ended up finishing that comic during that week and putting it online, just mainly because I posted all my art, before online as a way of just sharing with friends. And yeah, and like because it was so deeply personal to me, like I knew this is like what I wanted to make for myself. And it really was just a kind of cherry on top that it resonated with so many other people and so many other strangers online that I never thought they would even get their eyes on in the first place. And so it was very validating to hear that like a lot of people, even if they weren't from Wuhan or even if they weren't Asian, they still had like felt the sense of like a loss of home or like a loss of safety and a loss of belonging from everything that was happening in 2020 as well. And so I think that's what really made this book a need, both for me and the publisher, to be like, hey, like, let's get this universal story out there to like the hands as many young people as possible.
I want to get back to the publishing side later on. But Tiffany, what about you? Like this story with mountain lions, what made mountain lions your muse or the vessel to tell this story?
Yeah, well, so I mean, as I mentioned, I work in conservation, right? And one of the things that I do at the center is we work specifically to protect California mountain lions because they're struggling right now. And so a lot of what I do is read a lot of research. So I read a lot of scientific studies, and scientific studies are coming out that are showing that particularly mountain lions in California are so affected by roads and development that they're being isolated and becoming these genetically distinct subpopulations. And then those subpopulations, if they're getting so small and starting to inbreed so much that they might become extinct within decades. And so, like, what are the threats to these animals? Well, it's being hit by cars on roads, but it's also dying from ingesting rat poisons. It's also from dying in wildfire because they're so boxed in and they can't escape the wildfire like they normally would be able to if we didn't fragment the land so much. They're also being killed in retaliation for attacking livestock. And so there's just all these things that are driving this extinction vortex on this animal. And it was just like, gosh, this is awful. How do we help them? Right. And I think like having a story that's just more accessible than the studies that are being done, that the papers are being published, that could really go a long way. And so I think that was part of it. And then also I love animals. Like I am a nature nerd. Like I go hiking all the time and I'm like always looking for salamanders and always looking, what bird is that? And so like I love learning about the different animals and the different biodiversity in California. And there's so many species. And it's just like, did you know this fun fact about this salamander? Or did you know that like spiders are like this, and so it's just kind of like, I want to put that out there too. Like this book is about mountain lions, but it's also about like other really cool critters that I've come across just on my hikes. It might be 5 minutes from my house. It might be 30 minutes from my house. It might be in a national park. And so like, I think it was if you're asking like what was my inspiration, I think it's the biodiversity, but then also the struggle and that the way that people and wildlife are so connected, even if we're not that close to them or we don't think we're that close to them. I think we're closer than we think. And so that kind of really informed the story that I wanted to tell.
And then I want to touch on what the subject of the panel is, which is writing the real world and how you engage in real world topics and sort of funnel that into a singular story when there's so much to say. So Tiffany, I want to start with you. For this story in particular, how did you go about taking all of this information and sort of funneling it into a single character, a mountain lion?
That's a really great question. My process can be very scattered, but what really helped was, before we decided on like really fully committing to this project, I had a lot of discussions with the publisher about what should this book be about. And his whole thing was like, okay, like, so his name is Gregory Grouse, and it's from Reverberations Books. And he asked me to write a book about climate change or the environment, right? And I was like, well, those are really big topics, right? But then as I thought more about it and all the work I was doing with the mountain lions, I was like, oh, like, I think that's the story. I mean, they're so encompassing. They are often considered an umbrella species. And so it's just like, what they do and who they are kind of affects a lot of their surroundings. And so from there we were like, okay, so what would the story arc be? So then there was like some ideas, kind of brainstorming back and forth, and then like coming up with a very loose outline. And then it was like, okay, well, like we have this outline, like what would a chapter look like? If this book has chapters, what would a chapter look like? And so then I just kind of took a stab at like drafting a first chapter, and you know, trying to bring in the ecology and biology of a mountain lion, but then also the diversity of people that live in California, and then the space that we all occupy. And from there, it was like, he read the first chapter and then he was like, I think this looks really good. Let's go for it. And so then it was like, okay. And then it took a lot of like research. So even though I work with the species, and I do like a lot of my work is very overlapping with this book, there's also a lot that I learned by doing this book, right? Like I learned about beaver ecology, I learned about like certain salamanders and newts, and so there's a lot of, and like the history of the species and how people have interacted with them over time. And so there was definitely a mix of, you know, talking things out and brainstorming with people, talking to experts who know stuff about the species that I want to highlight, you know, taking things I'm doing at work that might seem relevant, like is this something that would be that other people would be interested in, and then trying to put it all together in a story where there's where like the story arc makes sense, I guess. I don't know how to fully describe that or explain that, but I don't know if I answered your question very well, but that was kind of my process. Okay.
No, you definitely did.
Okay.
Laura, I'm curious about yours too, because you know, with memoir, there are a lot of challenges, like getting people right, getting dialogue to get the point across. What were some of the challenges you faced in compiling all this into a singular story?
Yeah, those are all like really good points. For me, when I first started writing, I like to do what I call sort of like a brain barf, where I just take every memory that comes up to mind, or like everything story that I want to tell, and I just sort of like barf it onto my Google Doc. And so the very first draft of the story ended up being like twice as long as it ended up being. And as I was talking to my editor, like one of the biggest challenges was cutting it down as much as we could into something digestible within ideally 300 pages. And since it was also my very first time making a full-length graphic novel, I like to start off with a script first before I draw. And I quickly realized that like, even though my script says it's, you know, 280 pages, that's definitely not what the art is going to end up being. So I feel like a lot of the challenges were just sort of like really pacing myself well and like trying to cut down to the bare bones of like what are the most essential scenes to tell the story. And so to try to get the story right, I ended up going home and I did a lot of just like talking to my parents and my relatives back in Wuhan and going through like old diaries I had, which were like super embarrassing, like cringe to read, but like very necessary to kind of also nail down like the voice of, you know, like 13-year-old Laura. And then going through like old photo albums and stuff as well, just trying to draw as much memories as possible. Thankfully, like age-wise, I was still very like close to like my college and high school years at the time when I was writing. And so that was like a lot easier for me to kind of like, you know, I still think I'm like a teenager most days. So it was like a lot easier for me to just draw up that energy and those memories. But like as I wrote, I after every scene, I would like have very clear like why like I always ask myself like why this scene specifically, and then if I can't answer that sentence of like why the scene, then I cut out that scene. And I was just like very, very rigid about every single scene I put into Messy Roots to make sure I cut it all down to fit into what it is now.
I'm sure your editor loved that, and I want to get back to the editorial process as well later on. But you know, the challenge, speaking of challenges of writing just real world stuff in general, is like I'm curious if you felt pressure to like get it right, or to, if you worried about reaction or reader responses or anything like that? Because you both deal with very real issues, very real things that not everybody's gonna want to see, and that's something that writers and artists always have to contend with. So Laura, I'm curious if that ever got into your brain, and if it did, how you got it out.
Oh yeah, definitely. I up until then I've written personal comics before, and I would say most of the comics I like had published just like on my Insta were just very short comics about life. But this was the first time that I was not only digging to like my family history and putting like my actual family in there, but it's also like, as you said, Messy Roots does have a lot of like ugly moments, both ugly in terms of like things that maybe like younger me did that was wrong, or just like really embarrassing, or or like ways that like younger me was also maybe wronged by other real people in life. And I think the hardest to write was when younger me had conflict with real people that are still really close to me, and a lot of that included family members. And growing up, I never had a great relationship with my parents, and even now it's still has very high tension. And one thing I had in the back of my mind the entire time was, okay, like I'm writing a memoir by myself, and obviously in college I put a chapter in which I come out, but at the time when I was making the book, I was not out yet to my parents specifically. And that was like a huge challenge for me to decide, like, how am I going to portray this authentically, also with this like fear of like what will happen if my parents read it. And at the end of the day, I kind of like toiled like day and night just like worrying about it, and like at the end of the day I just told myself, like, my parents aren't the end audience. Like, yeah, it'd be cool if they read it, but the end audience is still the 15, 16, 20-year-olds out there who are really like lost about their place in the world, just the same way I was. And like some of them will be queer, and like some of them will want that authentic storytelling. And so once I kind of like sort of beat that into my head, I was less fearful about all these other perceptions of me from people who probably won't be the main audience.
Tiffany, what about you? Did you ever think about reader response? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Yes, most definitely. I thought about it. I still think about it. And I mean, I think for me, I did feel a lot of pressure. So one of my goals for this book was that, like, to provide something that kind of gives a little bit more in-depth information about the wildlife around us, and also to provide more representation for people who are not historically represented doing this kind of work, whether it's the science or the conservation work or whatever. And so I really wanted to make sure with the depictions of all the different animals that they were scientifically accurate. And because I didn't want like the puma ecologist that I talk to regularly for work be like, why did you do it like this? Pumas don't do that, or, and I don't think they would, but there's just this thing that like you want to get it as right as possible and as accurate as possible. And so I think that contributed to a lot of me doing a ton of research to try to be as thorough as possible. And sometimes what it would end up happening is that, when I was working with May Smith, who's like the incredible illustrator of this book, and it was a pretty big ask. I'd be like, this species of newt, this species of tarantula, and this species of like skunk, please draw them all accurately. And she did amazing, like incredible. And then sometimes they would just be like, oh, this coloration looks like a turkey vulture, but I kind of want it to be a California condor, like, can you revise it? And she was always really happy to revise it. Or like, sometimes it'd be like a lot of some things that I like to do in the book too is kind of highlight community members that enjoy wildlife. And so there's a newt protector page where there are people who go out and like save the newts crossing the street from getting hit by cars. And one of the newts had a coloration of a different salamander, and I was like, oh gosh, we have to change that. they'll get so mad. It's the wrong color, you know? And so I think thankfully Maytal was very patient with me. And very willing, because she put a lot of work into this too, and I really appreciated that. So
And I do want to get back to that too, getting it illustrated. But I wanted to ask, I believe the Tales of the Urban Wild is categorized as fiction. Am I right with that, or was it nonfiction?
it is fiction, but it's based on scientific facts and like scientific facts and events that happened.
So then I'm curious, and Laura, I'm going to ask you this as well, because whether you're telling a true story or not, there's always a bit that you have to make up. And I'm curious how much you felt you were able to take creative liberties with telling the story. Tiffany, we'll start with you.
I feel like for what I did, it's very much fiction. So I feel like in terms of what happens with the mountain lion, I felt like I had pretty overarching creative liberties. The only thing, I guess, I wouldn't say that I was limited by it, but it was something that I wanted to be accurate, right? So it was definitely like, is this something that could actually happen? Right? Because a lot of the things that we know about wildlife, especially very elusive wildlife who people don't normally see on the regular, and some won't ever see ever in their lives, even though they live so close to them. A lot of the point of view of what's going on in their lives is from a human perspective. It's from the scientists who study them, or like the people who caught them on their Ring camera going through their backyard, or like, I don't know, things like that, or scientific studies. And so I think with the story of this particular mountain lion, it's kind of, you hear bits and pieces of what happens to other mountain lions all throughout the state and all throughout the continent. And so it was kind of, I just wanted to make sure the narrative made sense in terms of what we know about the ecology and behavior of mountain lions. But beyond that, I felt like I could kind of create a story that beyond that, the story wasn't really limited in any way. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah.
You are. Yeah.
Okay.
No, that makes total sense. And then Laura, from your side, I always love asking memoirs, like, obviously this isn't a play-by-play of exactly what happened as it happened. So what were some of the places that you had to embellish a bit, or not embellish is the right word, but like lean into a bit of creativity, of filling in dialogue where you don't maybe know exactly what was said?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of memoir, is while all the scenes are real and happened, like at the end of the day, since you are the one telling the story, it's going to come from your perspective and like how you had perceived it, right? And like, even if you think about memory itself, like memory itself is not 100% fact, and like there's many ways our brain even naturally embellishes or changes things. And so for Messy Roots, in terms of like the facts, the fact versus fiction, definitely all these scenes and events happened as I had remembered them, and or could corroborate as much as I could. But there are ways that you can take creativity to sort of make your story a lot easier to maybe like digest, or like maybe a clearer to the reader. So like, for example, like friends that I had depicted back in middle school and high school, I depicted like 2 main friends during the whole book, but like I definitely had more than 2 friends in my years of 0 to 18 hopefully. Yeah. But obviously I can't like put them all in, like that would just be way too big of a cast. And they all affected me in different ways, but like generally I was like, I could sum up the ways that they impacted me into like 2 main characters, and then just like change their names and like have that character be like a representation of this group of friends, while this character is a representation of that group. So there's like stuff like that where you can like simplify things in your life, but like still keep the core as honest as possible. And then other things were like more like internal struggles. This is like sort of a trick for graphic memoir in general, is that internal struggle can be very hard to depict, especially if it's like a lot of like internal monologue, which can be kind of boring, or like maybe you just don't really remember like what you were angsty about when you were 13. But for me, like I wanted to depict it in a way that was very powerful in the art. So I used a lot of like White Rabbit and like Chinese mythology symbolism and imagery to kind of show this internal struggle between me and my, you know, Asian heritage. And like obviously I did not talk to like a mythical rabbit in real life, but like that is like something creative I can use as like a tool to like better tell the story and really draw the people into my mind space.
And I'm glad you brought up character, because that's what I wanted to ask about next. You know, you mentioned the other characters, but you have to write yourself into this as well. Was it a challenge depicting yourself and throughout the story?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's so hard. I feel like every time I drew myself doing something, like it was just like a bajillion questions of like, is this something I actually do? Am I drawing myself too well? Am I drawing myself like too poorly? Like, and like it wasn't even just like the visual side. Like I think I was very conscious of not depicting myself as like more so, but also like not as like less so. And I think I got it right, because at the very end, my editor was like, wow, like you really were like honest about like some of the bad things you've done. I was like, oh man, I don't want to portray myself as a bad person, but she's like, no, this is like very, very like true to like ways teenagers can be ignorant about something, or like just like, you know, mistakes you make when you're trying to figure yourself out. And so I think that was something I really wanted to like portray well. What was like a lot of the messier things in life.
And then Tiffany, you had your own unique challenge in character, because this is an animal, which is a tough character to build, I imagine. You briefly mentioned the arc of this character. I'm curious if you could touch on that a bit more, and what your process was in developing this mountain lion as an actual character.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, some decisions had to be made pretty early on as to like the identity of this mountain lion. Like, you know, we start with it's a young mountain lion. Is it male or female? Okay, it's male. Like why? And that's because you know, mothers will rear their young for a year and a half, maybe two, and then they disperse and they have to go find their own territory. But females don't have to go as far, because males that are in the dominant male in the area will kind of be okay with other females overlapping in their territory, but they're not as okay with other young males being in their territory. And so it was like, okay, so we can have this, if it's a young male mountain lion searching for his territory, he has to go a lot farther. He has to cross a lot more roads and go past a lot more development to find a place to live. And so I think once we decided that, it was like, okay, well, if he has to go really far, then he can be experiencing a lot of different things along the way, and that kind of helps. I mean, not that young female mountain lions also don't experience things, but I think it provided us a little more flexibility to tell more of the story. And so, I mean, I think that was something that, you know, I proposed right away, right? Because it just kind of made sense to me based on the biology of the mountain lion and the ecology of them. And then in terms of a story arc, you know, it's tough, right? Like, what's too much, what's too little? How do you decide like how much detail to go into, or you know, what's the important details, or like you know, how do you want to depict? I mean, the mountain lion is the protagonist, but there's other animals too. There's other mountain lions, but then there's also people, and then there's also like bobcats and coyotes and other animals that this character is going to be interacting with. And so then it came down to like, really trying to integrate the human stories with this one protagonist mountain lion story. And yeah, I don't know if you're looking for more than that, but that was kind of the process.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I love hearing all the background or all the thought that went into just the very basic traits, like male or female, old or young. Like that's fascinating to hear. Like it's funny to hear because, as you know, any character you make, you have to put those thoughts in. But for some reason, hearing it applied to a mountain lion, it's like, yes, like I love to hear all the thought process that went in there. So I want to get to the visual side of things too. Obviously, you know, these are stories that have two components. We talked a lot about the writing. I want to talk about the art as well. Tiffany, you mentioned having a great illustrator, Mydal Smith, who was very flexible with, you know, making sure they were specific species of these animals and it was all done correctly. I'm curious how you found Mydal. Like, how did you go out and find this illustrator? Were there other people in the running, or was this just the perfect fit?
Yeah, no, for sure. It was definitely a process. And it was something that the publisher and I worked on together, you know, and I think as I mentioned before, one of my goals was to provide more representation of historically underrepresented folks. And so we tried really hard, I guess, to look, well, I don't know, let me take that. Okay, start over. So I worked with the publisher, and we did some searching online. We did like we looked at, I think there were some websites where illustrators kind of, it's almost like a database, and so I think it was like Comics of Color was one, and then like there was like a queer comics database as well. And so like what we would do is kind of search online and look at people's art and be like, oh, like whose art do we like? Right? And you know, like who do we think would be cool with drawing animals that are scientifically accurate? You know, and so once we kind of came up with a list of people, we reached out to them and then we said, hey, we're thinking of writing this book, like would you be interested? And if you're interested, like would you be willing to provide like a sample page of what you like? Here's we had a chapter of the script written, so I was like, here's the chapter, like, you know, take a look and see if you're interested, and if so, could you provide a sample? And you know, we from there we narrowed it down, and then actually what ended up happening is the publisher spoke to someone who's an art teacher, and he recommended Maytal. And so then we were like, oh, like, okay, like let's, you know, and then we reached out to her as well. And we ended up really loving her work and asked her if she would work with us, and we're so happy that she said yes. So
I love that. And Laura, obviously you illustrated your own, and you've mentioned a lot of the process of that as well, but were there any other visual challenges, like separate from the writing side, that you found challenging or anything on the visual side?
Yeah, on the visual side, I also was able to sort of do a great partnership with the person who did my color and some art editing. Her name's Wei Shu, and I kind of found her online on Twitter just doing a call out, and she's also this like queer Asian Canadian artist who's super talented. And I think one of the things that we had to work through was how do we best sort of sequence the way that we work with each other so that we can really meet this hard deadline that my publisher gave me. And I think that was the biggest challenge, is really meeting that deadline, because both my publisher and I really wanted to get it out as soon as possible because of how topical the book was. But because like I would do like, you know, like edit the story while also doing some line art, and then send it over to Weiwei, who add color, do some like art editing, and send it back to me so that I can like edit it again, and then like add like the bubbles and text. And I feel like every time I looked at the art, there would be things I wanted to change, but I knew that if I wanted to make this small change, I'd have to go all the way back through that process again. And so a lot of it was just kind of picking my battles, deciding like what are the changes I know are really fundamental and important to like kind of do that process all over again, and like which ones am I okay just sort of like be okay maybe adjusting the text to make it fit the art, or like other ways to interpret it. So yeah, but like at the end of the day, that ended up being a really great collaboration, and like I highly recommend for anyone who like feels like they because like drawing your whole almost 300-page graphic novel is like a huge feat, and it can take many years. And I was doing this full-time, thankfully. Like if I was still working at my old job while doing it, I definitely could not finish it in the 2 years I had to do Messy Roots. And so I highly recommend if folks like want to partner up with someone to do color and or like typeset and or like other things, like it's always a great way to like have another like very artistic and like very smart mind to sort of feed off that creative energy and feed off ideas with.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned the publishing side, and I always save that for last. So I do want to talk about the business side of things as well. And you both got into a lot of it already. But I just want to get a feel of, you both had a professional publisher do this. Starting with you, Laura, you went to Harper Alley, I believe. What was it that made them the right fit? Were there others in the running? Anything like that?
Yeah, so the book actually ended up going with Balzer and Bray, but since Harper Alley is like the sort of like umbrella imprint for like all comics, it was like worked on with both. But when my agent was first selling my proposal, we did have like 5 different publishers interested. And what happens then is that your submissions up getting taken to auction, and then all the imprints and editors will like send their best bid. You get to like talk to all of them, and you feel like you're like on The Bachelorette before publishing, where they're really like trying to just like sell you on like their imprint, right? But at the same time, you're having these like very authentic conversations of like, what do you see in the book? Like, how would you change it and improve it? And you just want to make sure you're a good fit with like whoever you're gonna be working the next 3 years with. Like I just thought of it as like, this is going to be the longest relationship I have had at that point in my time. But I ended up going with my current editor, who's also editing my second graphic novel now, Donna Bray, and she's one of the co-founders of Balzer and Bray, of HarperCollins. And I went with her because she had this like really strong track record of publishing some great queer as well as like folks of color books that I personally have loved and read so much. Like I remember seeing that she did Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda, which ended up becoming Love, Simon the movie. And that was actually one of the very first like queer content I had ever consumed and like loved. So I was like, okay, like she's done such amazing work. I know I can trust her if like all these other authors trusted her too with their work. And she just had like the enthusiasm and like the ability to sort of like translate my vision into like her vision as well for the imprint.
Mm-hmm. And then Tiffany, you had a publisher come to you as well. Was the editorial process pretty simple? As simple as can be anyway. Like the whole process of getting the book done, were there any complications or challenges along the way?
Yeah, I think I feel like I was pretty lucky. There weren't any major obstacles that kind of got in the way. I think I really loved working with Maytal. I feel like we made a really great team and we had a really good rapport with each other, and we would talk things out, and I thought it all went really smoothly. I think maybe one thing that was like was we had a deadline. And often making those deadlines can be very, very challenging. And so I think, one thing to keep in mind when you decide to embark on an endeavor like this is that you may plan and think, okay, like I estimate this amount of stuff will take me 2 months. But then maybe it actually most likely will take 2.5 or 3 months. So I think that was just like from a, because you also don't know, like you don't know that until it's happening, right? Until you're doing it and working on it, and then it's like, oh, okay, this is taking longer than I thought it would. But even then we still made our deadlines and everything was great. But that was probably like maybe the stickiest part of our process.
And then we have one question. This is going to segue into my last little question of what's coming next for you. So first off, though, Tiffany, you have a question from Maria. Is Tales of the Urban Wild going to be a series of books?
Great question. I think we have to see how things go with this first book. But it is, with the title, it is pretty open-ended. And, you know, when I talk to other biologists, they get really excited because they are like, what's next? Obviously, it's going to be a salamander. Aren't you a herpetologist? You know, and so it's like people have very strong opinions about it. And I love it. I think it's amazing. You know, I think one thing about this book is like, I wish I had a book like this when I was like around 10 or something to see, because I would have loved it. And there just aren't many books like this out there that I know of, where it's like an educational thing, about like that goes into more detail about these different animals' behaviors and like the way they interact with each other. And I think there could be an audience for it. So we'll see.
So is that a loose commitment that if it does well, the next will be a salamander? Because that sounds pretty great.
I'm going to stay with we'll see. Thank you for your question.
Sure. Laura, what about you? What you mentioned, you got the next graphic novel coming out. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. Before that, I do want to give a shout out to Tiffany's book, because I got an early reading of it, and I too at the like last page was like, oh my god, what's next, like what's gonna happen. And so please everyone buy her book when it comes out so that we can get that next installment. But yeah, for me, I also, after my series came out, a bunch of readers were like, oh, is there going to be a sequel? Like, are you going to write another memoir? And then like at the time I was like, oh my god, I haven't like lived enough life to to like write a sequel yet. Maybe like in 20 years or so, once I've gotten more wisdom. But I did, because when I signed the initial contract with Harper, it was a 2-book deal. I do have a second book coming out, also with Pulitzer and Bray. Will probably come out end of next year, and I'm currently working on it, so I can't say too much about it yet. But I will like tease a little bit that it is a very, very cute YA, like queer sapphic rom-com, similar to like Heartstopper, and like just like really, really like sweet, but kind of tying in a lot of like my own personal battles with like family and religion and like just growing up in Texas. So yeah.
All sounds awesome. So now I want to ask y'all to promote yourselves. What your books, where people can find you on social media, websites, anything like that. So Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah. So once again, my book is this one, Messy Roots, a graphic memoir of a Wuhanese American. You can find it anywhere that sells books, like whether it be online or your local bookstore. And you can find me on socials. I'm on like almost every platform, usually at hello, hey, Laura Gao. Feel free to follow me, and I do have a website, lauragao.com. On the website, if you do have any like personal requests, questions, comments, you can send that into that form there, and I usually try to get to all of them after I'm done drawing.
Thank you. And Tiffany, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. I also want to plug Laura's work, because Messy Roots, as I said earlier, was amazing. And I'm super stoked to get my hands on her next book when it comes out. I don't have a physical thing of my book, but I do have the proofs, and I do want to show off a little bit of Maytal's work. And so this is the cover, and Laura is on the back cover because she provided a blurb. Thank you. And then I just want to show some of this amazing art. And the one, I'll just show one because I know we don't have much time. But this spread I really like a lot, and hopefully you can see it clearly. But it kind of shows the scientists working on tagging a mountain lion to include him in their study. And so I just really love how she depicted the work that the scientists do. So yeah, you can find me at, I have a website, tiffanyyap.com. If you want to pre-order the book, you can find ways to do that on the website as well. And I am on social platforms like Instagram, and I'm not sure if I can say Twitter, but that other one too. And you can find that on the website as well. I think probably the easiest thing is to go to tiffanyyap.com. And I see Greg is listening. Hi, Greg. And he put a link for where it can be pre-ordered. So thank you.
Yeah, no, this was great. Thank you both so much for taking the time to do this. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
To all of our listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks and we'll see you then.